Let's continue to read the biography of Isaiah Berlin, Alive, by Michael Ignatieff. This is chapter 15, Fame, and this is the third part. Berlin was also unusual among liberals of the 1950s in not being taken in by the Khrushchev thaw. A visit to Moscow in the summer of 1956 as a honeymoon journey with Ellen left him convinced that the Soviet regime was still expansionist and repressive at heart. The Politburo, whom he had met at an embassy reception, made him think of a thuggish group of Oxford College porters, at once smooth and brutal, class-conscious and corrupt, hideously jovial, and with an easy gangsterish flow of sentimental reminiscence. During that visit to Moscow, Berlin took Eileen to visit Pasternak at Prydakino. There, the writer told him that he had already sent the manuscript of Dr. Zhivago to his Italian publishers and was determined to see it published. Berlin begged Pasternak to consider the consequences for himself and his family. Martyrdom was a moral temptation like any other and should be resisted. Pasternak flared up, and Isaiah knew it was hopeless to press his case. Back in his room in the British Embassy in Moscow, Berlin read the manuscript, one of the first Westerners to do so, and concluded immediately that it was a masterpiece. On his return, Isaiah was instrumental in securing British publication of Dr. Zhivago, but he remained haunted by the memory of having put Akhmatova in danger. When Dr. Zhivago appeared in the autumn of 1958, Berlin was appalled that his Oxford colleague and friend George Katkev read portions of the manuscript on the Russian service of the BBC. This made official retribution against Pasternak inevitable. Berlin broke angry with Katkov over the issue. When the Soviet regime forced Pasternak to refuse the Nobel Prize and began the harassment that contributed to his early death in 1960, Isaiah felt his own caution had been vindicated. In 1958, Dmitry Shostakovich came to Oxford to receive an honorary degree, along with the French composer Francis Poulenc. Shostakovich arrived at Huntington House in an official embassy car, flanked by Soviet officials. The composer was small, shy, and looked like a chemist from Western Canada. Whenever his manders were around, he referred to them as his dear friends, and a nervous spasm would cross his face. But at a musical evening with Poulenc at Alexandra and Hugh Trevor Ropers, the Russian composer was transformed. As soon as a pair of musicians began playing his cello sonata, Shostakovich, who had been huddling in a corner like a frightened animal, shot to his feet, ran over to the score, and insisted that the players had made an error. It was discovered that they were working from a Western score, altered by the cellist Gregor Piatogorsky. These alterations Shostakovich angrily crossed out with a pencil, substituting the correct version. Isaiah then suggested that Shostakovich go to the piano and play. He performed a prelude and a fugue, with such passion and flair that everything they had heard by Polanyi sounded pale and plaid by comparison. The haunted, persecuted expression left Shostakovich's face only during those minutes when he was at the piano. The last of Isaiah's encounters with the great figures of the Russian intelligentsia occurred in 1965, when he and Maurice Bora managed to persuade their university to grant Anna Akhmatova an honorary degree. He had telephoned her in Moscow in 1956, and she had received the news of his marriage in icy silence. They had both decided it was not safe to meet. When she duly appeared in Oxford in June 1965, Isaiah was shocked to see how she had aged. She had gained weight, and he thought a little unkindly that she resembled Catherine the Great. But she carried herself like an empress and delivered herself of her opinions with imperial force. When she arrived outside Haddington House and surveyed the splendid garden, the three-story Georgian house, and Isaiah's new wife, she observed caustically, quote, "So the bird is now in its golden cage," end quote. The spark that had leaped between them 20 years before was now extinguished. He could only secure her the recognition in the West that was her due. She could only acknowledge it with a regal hauteur. He accompanied her as she stood in the Sheldonian and heard herself acclaimed in Latin as an embodiment of the past. Who can console the present and provide hope for the future? Afterwards, he was in attendance at the Randolph Hotel when she received Russian visitors who had come from all over the world to pay court to her. He was there too when she read from her verse, intoning the deep and sonorous rhythms into a tape recorder. She departed for Paris and home, and Isaiah never saw her again. She died the following year. His anti-communism had always been a declaration of allegiance to the intelligentsia of whom she was the last surviving heroine. After her death, she exclaimed to a friend that he would always think of her as uncontaminated, unbroken, and morally impeccable reproach to all the Marxist fellow travelers who believed that individuals could never stand up to the march of history. Berlin's unbending suspicion of a Soviet system led him to part company with the large number of his Oxford friends who joined the campaign for nuclear disarmament. In 1958, when Philippe Tomby asked for a statement in support of unilateral nuclear disarmament, Berlin replied with a rather uncharacteristic bravado that liberal principles were of little meaning unless one was prepared to risk one's very survival in their defense. Quote, "Unless there is some point at which you are prepared to fight against whatever odds and whatever the threat may be, not merely to yourself, but to anybody, all principles become flexible, all codes melt, and all ends in themselves for which we live disappear." In November 1960, Ignazio Salon and Niccolo Chiaramonte, illustrious Italian liberals, asked him to sign a manifesto supporting the FLN uprising against the French rule in Algeria. Berlin accepted the Algerian right to self-determination and condemned the brutality of the French war of counterinsurgency, but he could not endorse the FLN's use of terrorism against civilian targets. This loathing of the use of violence was applied consistently even to Zionists. When he met Menachem Begin in the lift of the King David Hotel, the very hotel that Begin's men had blown up in 1946 with the loss of 90 lives, Berlin refused to shake his hand. In May 1961, when the Kennedy administration sponsored the abortive invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles, Kenneth Tannen, the drama critic, wrote to Berlin asking him to sign an appeal condemning the operation. Isaiah declined on the grounds that Castro may not be a communist, but I think he cares as little for civil liberties as Lenin or Trotsky. Tannen's reply that Castro was less repressive than many other Latin American dictators may have been true, but Berlin wouldn't have none of it. Castro might be progressive, but his human rights record forfeited any right to support. These commitments on Hungary, Cuba, Algeria, and CND were consistent with liberal principles, but they earned Berlin growing suspicion on the left. Perry Anderson of the New Left Review attacked him in a memorable article for being one of the European immigrants to Britain who had done most to serve up to the English, a self-congratulatory picture of their own supposedly liberal virtues. Berlin indeed saw no reason to disagree. He loved England and told her so. Left-wing resentment came to a boil over the Deutsche Affair. There had never been much love lost between the two men. Deutsche had drawn blood with a scathing review in the Observer of Berlin's lecture on historical inevitability, and Berlin was antagonized by Deutscher's political dogmatism and his hostility to Zionism. In 1963, Deutsche, who was then completing his monumental biography of Trotsky, was being considered for a professorship in political studies at Sussex University. Berlin, who served on the university's academic advisory board, was asked by the vice-chancellor for his opinion of Deutscher's academic credentials. Berlin's reply that Deutsche was the only man whose presence in the same academic community as myself I should find morally intolerable, put paid to Deutscher's chances. Berlin hastened to say that he would have supported the claims of C. Wright Mills or Erich Hobsbawm, for they did not subordinate scholarship to ideology. The Deutsche Affair burst into flame in 1969 when the radical magazine Black Dwarf published the confidential correspondence and denounced Isaiah as an anti-communist witch hunter. His own part in the affair troubled Berlin. He maintained that if Deutsche had been offered a chair in Marxist thought, he would have had no objection. The difficulty lay in supporting that Deutsche could be counted on to teach non-Marxist concepts with the fairness requisite in a university teacher. This was a fair enough application of the standards of a liberal tolerance in a university. But Isaiah muddled the waters considerably by claiming that he himself remained a man of the left. In reality, as the Deutsche Affair shows, he was not of that political family at all. He was in fact committed to exploring and widening the divide that separated liberalism from socialism. Just how wide he believed this divide to be came through when the Labour politician Richard Grossman wrote to him in 1963, praising his essay, "Does political theory still exist?" But taking Berlin to task for giving such short shrift to the British democratic socialist tradition represented by Lasky, Tawney, Lindsay, and T.H. Green. Lasky, Berlin tartly replied, was a shallow rhetorician, while Lindsay's ideas were like London buses. They loomed up and disappeared again into the rhetorical fog. Only Tawney retained his respect for the moral seriousness of his politics and the quality of his historical learning. Berlin's polemics with the left continued throughout the 1960s. In 1961, E.H. Carr devoted a portion of the Trevelyan lectures at Cambridge to an attack on Berlin's historical inevitability. Carr questioned whether Berlin believed in the possibility of a historical explanation at all, given his indifference to social and economic factors, and given his apparent belief that historians should be chiefly concerned not with the explanation but with a moral evaluation. Surely, Carr argued, no one seriously supposed that a historian's task was to bother with the question of whether Hitler or Cromwell were bad fellows. Their task was rather to understand the factors that had enabled them to come to power and the forces with their rule unleashed. Carr's lectures were highly public events, rebroadcast on the BBC, published weekly in the Listener, and eventually assembled in a hugely influential text, What is History? Replying to Carr was a challenge that Berlin could not duck. In a series of letters to the Listener, as well as in private exchange with Carr himself, Berlin insisted that Marxist theory put an almost exclusive emphasis on abstract socio-economic causation and neglected the importance of the ideas, beliefs, and intentions of individuals. This falsified causation itself and robbed historical language of the evaluation force which it has in common speech in the interests of moral objectivity. Moreover, the supposed moral objectivity of Marxist historiography was bogus. Carr's history was the story of the rise and eventual triumph of the progressive forces, the proletariat and the Bolshevik Party. They were judged to be progressive, Berlin insisted, simply because they had succeeded. For Carr, the failures of the minorities belong, in Trotsky's famous words, to the rubbish heap of history. For Carr, the task of a historian was to pick the winners. In a letter of a reply to Berlin, Carr professed to be puzzled by this winner and loser business. If he were writing a history of cricket, he said, he would give space to the batsman who scored hundreds of runs, not to the nice young man who muffed the catch. Berlin remained on genial personal terms with Carr throughout the controversy, but the gulf between them was unbridgeable. Berlin insisted that the losers' questions were as pertinent as the winners' answers. The duel with Marxists was not the only area in which Isaiah was forced to apply liberal political principles in practice. He sometimes found himself wavering uncomfortably. In the first days of Anthony Eden's ill-fated Swiss operation to seize the canal from Nazaré in 1956, Berlin wrote to Clarissa Eden, lending her husband his support. As the operation continued, however, it dawned on him that even if the invasion succeeded, Britain and France would have to occupy Egypt, or at least the Canal Zone, in the teeth of a aroused Arab nationalist opposition, and that such colonial policing operations were doomed to failure. From then on, he turned against Eden's Swiss policy. But this volte-face, relatively rare, troubled him. He realized that he had allowed his pro-Israeli convictions to pull him in one direction and his anti-colonialist inclinations to pull in the other. He often found it deeply uncomfortable to be asked to give a concrete political advice. In 1958, David Ben-Gurion asked 50 sages, including Berlin, whether the time had come to challenge the Orthodox rabbis' monopoly over how the Jewishness of new immigrants and converts to Judaism should be ascertained. The question sharply divided Israeli society and had caused governments to fall. At issue was the very definition of who was a Jew. Did the children of a certain mixed marriage belong? Berlin was resolutely secular, but he replied that for Ben-Gurion to force the issue now would sow needless contention between secular and religious Jews. The status of the Jews is unique and anomalous, composed of national, cultural, religious strands, inextricably intertwined. To attempt either to affirm their indissolubility or to attempt the separation of these strands must inevitably lead to deep and bitter disagreement. He recommended that Ben-Gurion avoid the Klugkampf with the religious parties, but he ducked out of further involvement in the controversy by saying that the Jews in the diaspora, like himself, should not meddle in Israeli affairs. He was more comfortable outside the political realm altogether, collaborating with artists. In 1958, through Nicholas Nabokov, he met the composer Igor Stravinsky and his friend and amanuensis Robert Kraft. Stravinsky, he reported to a friend, was far tinier than anyone supposed, and his face had a ceaseless mobility, which made him fascinating to watch. Berlin was drawn to Stravinsky's vitality and even enjoyed his malice. For example, when asked his opinion of Benjamin Britten, Stravinsky replied suavely, "Such a marvelous accompanist," and Berlin could not help but warm to someone who, when asked for his opinion of Wagner, replied, "If you listen to Parsifal, articulating that word slowly and distinctly, you'll hear many very disagreeable sounds." In October 1961, at a lunch at Huntington House, the composer said that he had been asked by the State of Israel to compose a piece in honor of the Jerusalem Festival. Did Berlin have any ideas for a suitable libretto? Isaiah hurried upstairs to his library and came down with a copy of the Hebrew Bible. Thumbing through it, he first suggested the biblical account of creation in the book of Genesis, but Stravinsky thought the result would be too long, like a British weekend. Then Berlin suggested Abraham's bending of Isaiah. At the moment when, in obedience to God's command, a father prepares to sacrifice his own son. Berlin read out a few of the Hebrew songs, Elam, Elohim, and Stravinsky seemed to listen intently to their musical rhythm. A collaboration began. Berlin sent Stravinsky a complete transliteration of the Hebrew text with an English translation beneath. When the work was ready, Berlin was invited to Jerusalem to watch the dress rehearsals and the first performance. He found the music of the Abraham and Isaac cantata baffling, but he found the spectacle of Stravinsky on the podium riveting. The composer came to the podium looking as frail as a porcelain doll, but when he said Salam in a faint voice, the Israeli audience applauded wildly. As the music was performed, the audience, a forest of white and blue shirts and mobs of rough white hair, seemed bewildered, having no idea what the songs were meant to convey or whether they were meant to be anything at all, but applauding nonetheless at the end, because they understood the compliment that Stravinsky had intended to the Jewish tradition. As for Stravinsky, he enjoyed Israel thoroughly, sat in the King David Hotel's restaurant, drank quantities of Irish whiskey, and behaved benignly to everyone. He was even amused by the spectacle of Berlin persuading the band leader of the hotel restaurant to cease playing large waltz tunes in the composer's hearing. Throughout the 1960s, Berlin continued to spend semesters in the United States, first at Harvard, then at the City University of New York, which gave him a part-time chair. Oxford had never provided much of the home for his idiosyncratic blend of philosophy, ethics, and intellectual history. It was to the States that he went for congenial academic company. The Russian scholars Martin Malia, Adam Ulam, Richard Pepys, Mark Reeve, and James Billington, the critics Edmund Wilson and Lionel Strayling, the historian and Democratic political activist Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the philosopher and historian of ideas Merton White. Berlin now was in such demand that his tours in America took on the quality of a royal progress, much to the irritation of Edmund Wilson, who confided to his diary that his old friend was behaving more and more like a royalty. Other friends also noticed that Isaiah had become a grand figure. In his diary, Stephen Spender recorded his exchange with a lift attendant in New York. Did you read Sir Isaiah Berlin's article in the New York Times about the historic past? I'm afraid not. Well, Sir Isaiah's right. You cannot know nothing about the past until you're dead. In the autumn of 1962, Berlin established himself alone in Lowell House, Harvard, to prepare the Store's lectures at Yale on 3 turning points in political thought: the Greeks, Machiavelli, and Romanticism. But the most weekends he spent in New York or Washington in glittering company. It was a Camelot's hour of glory, and many of the friends he had first met in wartime Washington had been drawn into the Kennedy court. Arthur Schlesinger was a special counsel to the president. Walter Rostov and Mike George Bundy were White House advisors. Phil Graham and his wife, Kay, were publishers of the Washington Post, while Joe Alsop was the most influential columnist of the day. Other figures like George Kennan and Charles Bolin were presidential counselors on foreign affairs. In mid-October 1962, Joe Alsop invited Isaiah to a small private dinner in honor of Chip Bolin, who was leaving to take up his post as American ambassador in Paris. Kay and Philippa Graham, Arthur Schlesinger, the Bolins, and the French ambassador and his wife were there. Berlin watched the president arrive with Mrs. Kennedy and circled the room, shaking hands like a Napoleon meeting, greeting his marshals. There was the same intensity, complicity, and adoration, the same cult of toughness and ruthlessness. Before dinner, the president took Chip Bolin out into the Alsop's garden, and the two could be seen strolling up and down, deep in conversation. Over dinner, the president joked in the breezy style of a Palm Beach playboy, eyeing Berlin suspiciously, so Isaiah thought, like a man of action, faced with a notorious, possibly unintelligible, or even ironical intellectual. After dinner, he took Berlin aside, and his manner became intense and businesslike. Why were the Russians not making more trouble in Berlin? Kennedy wanted to know. What did the Russians typically do when backed into a political corner? Berlin replied as best he could. Well, Kennedy listened with terrifying attention. As Isaiah later recalled to Schlesinger, I have never known a man who listened to every single word that one uttered more attentively. His eyes protruded slightly. He leaned forward towards one, and one was made to feel nervous and responsible by the fact that every word registered. Kennedy invited Berlin to compare Khrushchev's intentions with Stalin's, and then said that someone should write a book on Stalin's philosophy. Quote, in what sense do you mean philosophy? End quote, Berlin asked. And the president replied that every great political leader had a particular set of principles that he followed. Berlin didn't think Stalin had a philosophy worth the name, but he did not press the point. Kennedy seemed obsessed with greatness. Whenever he mentioned Stalin, Lenin, or Churchill, his eyes shone with a particular glitter. But there was none of the case of a great man about him. Berlin sensed that. For the president, life was a series of hurdles to be crossed by means of enormous inner concentration and effort. He also had the sinking sensation that all his Washington friends were waiting on the edge of the conversation to see how he was faring, and his own impression was that he was not faring well at all. After a half-hour grilling, the president rose, rejoined the company, and said, cordially but firmly, you must go sit next to Jackie. She wants to bring you out. She turned out to have a sharper and a shrewder intelligence than her exterior had led Berlin to believe. She was cutting about Aldi Stevenson, whom she seemed to despise as much as her husband did. Isaiah found himself feeling sorry for her. because there seemed to be an edge of melancholy and exclusion to everything she asked. Their conversation turned to her fears for what her husband would do after his presidency. As he wrote to Ellen afterwards, she said she had a horror for her future after Jay ceased to be president. Boston would be terrible, and Jay, would lapse into his family's habits, which were worthless, utterly frank. The next morning, the president announced that American overflights of Cuba had discovered Soviet missiles on Cuba oil. The president had first seen these photographs on the morning of Alsop's dinner party. His conversation in the garden with Chip Bolin had been about how to confront the Russians with the information. With his uncanny ability to be at the right place at the right time, Isaiah had been center stage on the first night of the Cuban Missile Crisis. As he thought back over the evening, he was astonished at the president's sang-froid and good humor. As the crisis unfolded, Berlin watched the president's speeches on television in the company of undergraduates at Lowell House and went to overflow meetings at Harvard's Sanders Theater, where large crowds were addressed by not very competent orators. As usual, Isaiah stood apart from the general atmosphere of worry and told his cleaning lady when she anxiously asked him whether there would be a war, that there could not be one. Once the crisis was over, the White House called again to invite him to a small dinner organized by Mrs. Kennedy to celebrate. The president was in a glow of absolute happiness, though he confided that Cuba No. 2 would never quite expunge the stain of Cuba No. 1. This time, talking with the president was easier, though Berlin confessed in a letter to Noah Annan that he was really no good at a roundtable discussion of ICBMs, of middle-range weapons, the strategic importance of Assam, or even the secrets of the British Minister of Defense. As for Kennedy, Berlin had the sense of someone consciously striving to attain a place in history, striving to be equal to the great duel with the Soviet Union. He remarked that he did not expect to have a quiet term of office, and obviously believed that in Khrushchev he had found his morality. It was also clear that he was haunted by his father's reputation as a appeaser, and that the Munich analogy led the president to believe that resistance must be offered at once to any incursion on the Russians' part. Kennedy's self-dramatizing quality, this perception of himself as a character with a fate and a destiny, Berlin found both fascinating and unappealing. When he relaxed sufficiently to tell the president a rather frivolous story about Lenin's private life, the president cut him off abruptly, apparently displeased that historical figures should be discussed with such levity. Despite this fraudier, a further invitation rapidly arrived, this time to a lecture at the informal seminar held at Bobby and Arthur Kennedy's home. Hickory Hill, Berlin knew that his rival A.J. Ayer had lectured there and had not been a conspicuous success. The militantly anti-religious Ayer had pulled such ridicule on Arthur Kennedy's attempts as a good Catholic to introduce Thomas Aquinas into the discussion that Bobby had hissed. Drop it, Ethel. Berlin at first refused the invitation, but after appeals by the British ambassador agreed. The president asked for the meeting to be held in the White House. The seminar was conducted after dinner on 12 December, attended by George Bundy, Robert McNamara, Arthur Schlesinger, Robert Kennedy, Walter Rostov, and other key figures of the administration, together with their wives. Alan Berlin attended and found the president captivatingly good company. After dinner, with the president sitting in his rocking chair, listening intently, Berlin rose to speak. Had he been more ambitious, more policy-minded, more of a cold warrior, he might have chosen a subject calculated for the president's ear. Instead, he chose to talk about the artistic commitment among the 19th century Russian intelligentsia. In his seminar, he tried to explain how communism, imported into Europe as a secular, theoretical, abstract doctrine, was transformed by its contact with the earnest Russian intelligentsia and their belief in the social functions of thought, and return to Europe in Lenin's form as a fiery, sectarian, quasi-religious faith. Even for such a relatively intellectual subject, Berlin felt the full force of the president's tense, omnivorous attention. At the end of the talk, the president asked him what had been of the fate of the intelligentsia after the revolution, who had collaborated, who resisted, and what difference the reaction of the intelligentsia has made to the course of the revolution. Again, Berlin had the sense of a president measuring everyone, weighing who would stand up to pressure, who would break, and at what point, as if such questions were the ones he insistently posed to himself. Later that month, Berlin, together with Stuart Hampshire, was in the lobby of New York's Carlyle Hotel on his way up to see his mother-in-law. The lifts were blocked, and no one was allowed to leave the lobby. Suddenly, the hall filled with a moving wedge of Secret Service agents and policemen, behind whom briskly walked the president. He spied Isaiah, walked over, shook his hand, and asked him what he was doing there. Berlin said he was just a fan without waiting for his autograph. The president laughed, complimented him again on his lecture, and said that they must meet again. Then he walked to the car and was gone. Berlin was obviously flattered by the president's attention, but he remained less struck by Kennedy than were his friends. He was not drawn towards the fame of power. There was no reservoir of frustration within him about the passive, spectatorial limitations of intellectual life that a powerful man could exploit. He enjoyed the spectacle of Camelot, but it left him fundamentally unmoved. Camelot's interest in him represents the high point of his reputation on the American East Coast. After the visit to Kennedy White House, he would never enjoy quite such a favor again. He was also shrewd enough to see that the relative prestige of the English in Washington had suffered a drastic decline since the Roosevelt years. As he wrote to Robert Oppenheimer, director of the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, only Russia, China, and the United States were fully real to American policy makers. In their eyes, Europe lacked any strongly discernible personality. When he returned to Oxford in 1963, Berlin felt for the first time that he was returning to a diminished and second-rate country. He was at Sussex University, just about to mount the platform to give a lecture in November 1963, when he was told of the president's assassination. For about 10 minutes, he found himself unable to speak. Then, without commenting on the news or referring to it in any way, he went out and read his scheduled lecture on Machiavelli.